If you haven't had a major fail in your career, that means you're not pushing yourself hard enough. When I think back on my career, I could think of two major fails that I had during the interview process. First major fail that I ever had in terms of the interview process for a job was for a very well known Fortune 500 company. I won't say the name, but it rhymes with Schmoogle. And I remember I was still earlier on in my career applying for a senior analyst role because I come from a finance background. So I secretly took this phone interview with the recruiter in the car in the parking lot of my current employer at that time. And it was during my lunch break. It was for 30 minutes, and I remember sweating in that car. It was in the heat of the summer. I didn't want to turn the car on because I didn't want to bring attention to people to see that I was in the car on the phone. I don't know why I was so worried. I was afraid people would know that I was interviewing. So I had the car off and I wanted it to be completely silent and quiet for the interview. So I sat in there sweating. And as the interview started, we started with the usual conversations of tell me a little bit about yourself, so on and so forth. So I described myself, basically regurgitated my resume, which was one mistake that I made. I didn't know any better back then. So I said, I'm Ricky, and this is my experience. I used to work here, now I work here, so on and so forth. Then the recruiter turned over and started to ask questions and said, okay, well, this role, as you know, is a technical role. It's more focused on the audit side, and it's part of the audit team here at X company. Tell me about how you would approach this situation if you were the lead on this team. And so she started asking me more technical questions around what types of things I would look at, what types of questions I would look at. And I got very flustered because in my mind, I prepared for questions like accounting questions and questions that had a right or wrong answer. I wasn't really prepared for questions like, tell me about how you would approach this, those situational type questions. Second mistake that I made, I didn't really prepare for the right questions. I prepared very strongly on the technical side, but on the situational side, I was lacking. And so I felt flustered and I started rambling and I started saying, well, I would think about this and oh, also this. And there wasn't a clear flow to my answer. And I would say about a minute into my answer, the hiring manager cuts me off and says, Ricky, I have to stop you here and I have to end the interview here because it's clear that you aren't the right candidate for this role, unfortunately, based on what we've been talking about. And at that moment, I felt so down on myself and I didn't even know how to respond. I had never experienced that before. So I said, oh, okay, well, thank you for the opportunity. And I looked at my clock and it was only 6 minutes into the conversation of a 30-minute interview. So I knew I tanked it. And so I said, okay, well, thank you. And I hung up the phone. From there, I continued to feel very, very down on myself. I, of course, got out of the car, drenched in sweat, and I didn't even eat lunch. And I went back to my desk and I just felt like a failure. I felt like I failed the interview. I felt like I had no confidence and I just felt like it was a dead end road for me because I was very unhappy at that point with the job that I was doing. I was working very, very long hours and just experiencing a lot of burnout. That was the first major fail. And what I learned from that was the preparation for an interview really needs to be focused on, of course, the technical skills. Skills, if you're interviewing for a finance role, you would be brushing up on your skills around analysis and coming up with examples of when you put together presentations and things like that. But also, you need to spend just as much time, if not more time, focused on the soft skills, the part where it doesn't really come across on your resume of all the hard skills and the technical results that you drove. During the interview, you need to be prepared to talk about your how. And what I mean by that is not only do you need to highlight the what, which is I did X, Y, and Z, and that had A, B, C results. You also need to highlight your how, which is how you actually thought through that process, how you came up with that idea, maybe how you influenced other people, how you communicate, and how you're able to implement something from an idea to a reality. That's very important. And that's what I was missing in that conversation because I was so focused on making sure that I was prepared to answer all those technical questions and accounting questions that I knew very, very well. But I wasn't ready to answer a situational question like that of show me how you think. That's what hiring managers want to know. Hiring managers want to know how you approach a problem and how you actually problem solve, as opposed to jumping immediately to the outcome and saying, I did X, Y, and Z. Second major fail that I could think of is another Fortune 500 company, very, very well known in the tech space. And that is the interview for a role where I knew it was a bit of a stretch because it was in a different team than I had experience in. But I had the strong analytical skills and I also had strong communication skills, and I was able to highlight that during the interview process. So I made it all the way to the end of the process, which was the final interview with the senior VP of this entire organization. And in that interview, I sat in the office, this was in person, and I waited for the senior VP to walk in. And he walked in 5 minutes late, and he was wearing a dress shirt, and he came in and he sat down across from me. And he kind of looked at me like this, and then he crossed his arms. He didn't say anything. So I, of course, naturally leaned forward and I introduced myself. And I said, hi, I'm Ricky Koo. Very nice to meet you. And he said, I'm so-and-so. And he seemed very disinterested to begin with, almost as if I was inconveniencing him to take time out of his schedule to be interviewing for this role. So immediately I had this negative vibe and negative energy feeling, even though throughout all of the other interviews prior to that, I had a very, very positive feeling and I was feeling very confident. But immediately when he walked into the room and gave off this energy and this vibe, almost of disinterest and I want to say disgust, which I'll get to later on in the story of why I felt that disgust, it made me feel very uncomfortable. But the interview progressed and he kind of looked through my resume. We went through the usual questions. I had solid answers for them and it was good. It was a good pace until he asked a question and he said, tell me about how you would work with the stakeholder on this team. And so I proceeded to answer that question. I learned from my first major fail, which was to prepare for the situational type of questions. And I had specific examples. So I said, okay, well, this one time I was working with this person and they were on the go-to-markets team. And I used the terminology go-to-markets, plural, when in fact you're supposed to just say go-to-market. It's not plural. And that was a mistake on my part. I was inexperienced. And in that moment, what he did was he immediately leaned in like this. And he gave me this disgusted look, almost as if I had done something super horrendous. And he said, it's go to market. And he kind of spit a little in my face. And I was very taken aback by that. And immediately I apologized and said, oh, sorry, yes, I used the wrong terminology. Sorry about that. And I proceeded to answer. And the rest of the interview was a blur because up until that point, I was feeling very confident and I was feeling very secure in my answers. But when he behaved that way and when he leaned in and gave me that disgusted look, just because I made that mistake of using go-to-markets, plural, as opposed to go-to-market, it made me feel so small and so insignificant that I completely cowered back and my confidence level tanked. And that completely shifted the entire interview to where I don't even remember the rest of the questions and the rest of the conversation. All I remember was thanking him for his time, shaking his hand, and leaving with my body completely drenched in sweat and not really sure what had happened. because in that moment, I had never felt that way during an interview. Where, of course, going back to the first example, I did feel stupid and I felt like my confidence level tanked. But that hiring manager didn't make me feel as though they were disgusted. They just very clearly and directly said, you're not the right one for this, and it's clear based on your answer. That's okay. But this hiring manager, who was a senior VP of this entire organization for a very large and well-known Fortune 500 company, made me feel so small. Whether it was intentional or not, that was the outcome and that was the impact. Of course, needless to say, I did not get that job. But the lesson that I learned from this is that people in positions of power, sometimes, whether intentional or not, make others feel small so that they can feel bigger themselves because they can. And in that moment, I would like to believe that he didn't set out to make me feel small and he didn't intentionally want to make me feel stupid. But his behaviors and actions definitely led to that, because the way that he looked at me, I can still remember his expression. And I haven't seen that expression on another human being in many situations. And I can still recall, I'm getting goosebumps right now, thinking about just how I felt in that moment. I felt as though I did something really, really terribly wrong and that I owed this person something. Now, the big lesson that I learned here is in an interview, you always need to maintain your composure and your presence. If you are feeling flustered inside, that's okay. We're humans. So learn some tactics or techniques that help you feel more grounded again. One tip that I like to use sometimes is if I'm wearing shoes, which hopefully during an interview you are wearing closed-toed shoes, wiggle your toes a little bit in your shoes. That will help release some of the energy that is making you feel nervous. And that will basically help connect you back to your body and make you feel grounded. Another tip that I like to do is when the interviewer maybe is asking a question and I'm feeling super nervous and I feel my heart pounding, what I like to do is also just simply run my tongue across the roof of my mouth. I'm doing it right now. I just did it. And you probably didn't notice it. That is something that one can tickle us and make us feel a little bit more lighthearted, but also it is kind of like a reminder for yourself of, hey, I'm here, your body is here, it's okay, you're feeling these emotions, you're here. And it just kind of connects you again back to your body and makes you feel more grounded. So those are two quick tips that I like to practice. And the other thing that I learned through this very, very horrendous interview is that it doesn't matter what people say or how they set out to make you feel. It's your response that matters. And in that moment, I allowed this behavior to completely take over my interview, which looking back on all the previous interviews leading up to this one, they were very successful. I was one of the final candidates and I probably had a really good shot at getting this role. But because of how that person made me feel in that moment, I completely was absorbed in that and I focused on that and allowed that to completely take over the entire interview, where I wasn't showing up as my most authentic and most confident self anymore. And that is where I messed up. And ultimately, that's what costed me that job. Now, in hindsight, of course, I'm very glad I didn't get that job because that company's culture is known to be not very great. So I had to kind of dodge a bullet in that sense. But that was a huge learning for me, where it is a type of self-regulation and it's a type of self-maturity where regardless of what happens around you in your environment and what people might say to you or how they might speak to you, their tone, and how that might impact you, put that aside momentarily during an interview especially, because you don't want your interview to be derailed based off of someone else's behaviors, right? You should be in control of the interview in terms of how you want to show up, because then the best thing that could happen is you don't get the job, but it's because of your own actions and it's not because of someone else's actions that led to that. So that's just a reminder that you have full control during an interview And the practice of self-regulation takes a lot of time and intention and effort, but it also takes a bit of awareness. So that was a huge learning for me, where going forward, when I start experiencing those physical feelings of my heart is racing, I feel this gut-wrenching feeling in my stomach when someone says something to me as though I've done something terribly wrong, I am able to emotionally regulate myself in that moment so that it doesn't impact my performance, whether it's an interview or a presentation or whatever it might be. I remain stoic and I remain confident because I take back that control. I don't give the remote control to someone else, no matter how they're speaking to me or no matter what they're saying to me in that moment. That is the biggest lesson that I learned out of those 2 failed interviews. And again, if you haven't had a major fail, if you think back on your career and you can't think of a major fail where you just felt so gutted and you felt like you were on the floor or you were crying, then you probably haven't pushed yourself enough. So this is a reminder for you also to think about where you're at right now in your career and what changes you might want to make. Because if you haven't felt that level of uncomfortableness and that level of defeat throughout your career, that means you can push yourself more. So I look forward to talking more about that with you. And if this video resonated with you, please feel free to like and comment and subscribe. I would love to hear about what types of situations or what failures you face in your career. Until next time, thank you so much for watching. Take care.